This is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. The book is Taking Midway, Naval Warfare, Secret Codes and the Battle That Turned the Tide of World War II. The author, Martin Dugard. As co-author of the best-selling Killing series, Martin Dugard is one of the most widely read writers today. In 2021, Dutton launched his first solo series with the national bestseller Taking Paris to great acclaim. Each book in the Taking series acts as a standalone installment and immerses readers in one city and its turning point during World War II, Taking Berlin and Taking London, followed by Taking Paris. And now, for the first time, Dugard has set his sights on a very pivotal battle outside of Europe with Taking Midway. In 1942, everywhere around the world, the Allies are losing the war. Nowhere is this felt more completely than in the Pacific, where Japanese sea and ground forces claim victory after victory. Singapore falls, then the Philippines. The vaunted American Navy fights to a draw with the Japanese at the Battle of Coral Sea. America's lone moral victory is ColonelJimmy Doolittle's bombing raid on Tokyo, though even that is tinged with tragedy as two crew members are shot down and beheaded. In Honolulu, a brilliant young naval officer is determined to break Japan's top secret communication codes. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort is inches away from cracking the code by April. He is then startled to learn that the Japanese are planning yet another major invasion somewhere in the Pacific. Admiral Yamamoto is planning to send 4 aircraft carriers to complete this task in a bold attack that will be even larger than the December 41 attack on Pearl Harbor. Rochefort's methods are unique, and those in power in the U.S. Navy find his data flawed. Simply, many just don't believe him. The best mind in the U.S. Navy believes the next big attack will come at New Guinea or Australia. To prove himself, Rochefort must not only find the precise location, but also predict the date. What ensues is the cat and mouse adventure that will become the epic fight known as the Battle of Midway. Japan's Yamamoto will go toe-to-toe with American Admirals Chester Nimitz, Jack Fletcher, and Raymond Spruance. The dramatic battle will involve strategy, luck, heartbreak, and will also change the course of World War II. Martin Dugard is the New York Times bestselling author of several books of history, among them Taking London, Taking Paris, Taking Berlin, I mentioned the Killing series too, and The Explorers. I am happy to have Martin Dugard join me here on the Speaking of Writers podcast. Welcome, Martin.
Steve, that was an amazing intro. I think we can just end it right here.
That's it.
That's
That
it.
that told the whole story. Thank you. Well, thank
Really
you for
well
being
done.
here. Thank you. And what inspired you to write Taking Midway? Was there a personal or historical curiosity that pulled you toward this pivotal battle?
Not really. It was just that, I'd written, when I did taking taking London, I'm sorry, taking Paris was kind of World War II from the start of the European War up until the liberation of Paris in August 1944. Taking Berlin went from literally that jumping off point all the way to the end of the war. When I came back to taking London, it was to kind of clean up a little bit, just because I wanted to write about the Battle of Britain, and that took place at the start of the war in Europe. And it was kind of a standalone thing, and I'd always been fascinated by it. But whenever you finish a book like that, the question is always, what next? And I didn't want to do just a specific battle like, Market Garden or even taking Rome, which took place the day before D-Day in 1944. And so I thought I'd go not just to the Pacific, but to write about naval warfare, which I had never tackled before. And it's a completely different method of waging war. And as an author, it's a completely different method of writing history. Because if you are writing about, for instance, the war in Europe, you're thinking about Winston Churchill, you think about George Patton, Montgomery, and, different individual heroes. But in the Pacific, because of the aircraft carriers, the soldiers, the pilots, the admirals are all still very much the key players, but you kind of have to make ships sexy. You have to make people relate to an aircraft carrier. And so it has to become a living, breathing entity that you want people to care about just as much as they might care about a famous general, and that was the task, and that's kind of what I set out to do. And next thing you know, I kind of focused on Midway, it just because it's such an important battle.
Martin, for viewers who are unfamiliar with the Battle of Midway, why is it often considered the turning point of the Pacific theater in World War II?
Well, what people, is we our chronology always starts with December 7th, 1941, and between that, the stunning attack on Pearl Harbor in June 1942, which really isn't that much, 6 months, 7 months, that's when you have Midway. Midway, there had been other battles in between, but this was the first really crucial, pivotal offensive moment on the part of the Japanese because if they take Midway, they're only 1,200 miles all of a sudden from Pearl Harbor. They have a base within reach of our entire fleet. And quite frankly, if they'd had Midway, they would have the wherewithal to attack Oahu with impunity. And if we had been driven out of Oahu and out of Hawaii with our fleet, we would have had to wage war from the west coast of America, and the Japanese would literally have owned the Pacific Ocean. So this is really this. If we had not won this battle, it would have set the war in the Pacific back a number of years.
One of the key elements here is code breaking. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort. How central was the role of American code breakers in shaping the outcome of the battle?
Well, it was vital, but it's weird that going into it, the higher ups in the Navy still didn't trust code breaking and intelligence. We remember some of the carriers still in the Pacific at that time, the older carriers like Langley still had carrier pigeon coops. That's how outdated some of these vessels were, and people were still thinking in those terms. And so when Rochefort came in there, I love Rochefort because he's such an unlikely individual. He and his team of code breakers worked in a basement office. They called it the dungeon, of course. You got to call it that. They had their own desks. Rochefort wore a uniform, but he wore a smoking jacket over it. He put on a pair of slippers when he went into the office. The room was filled with cigar smoke, pipe smoke, cigarette smoke, and it was just a bunch of really extremely intelligent men staring at scraps of paper, trying to see how they all came together to break the Japanese code.
With a book like this, Martin, how do you balance technical naval strategy? Because there's a lot of it with compelling narrative storytelling.
Well, the thing about Midway, it's one of those battles like Gettysburg, or one of those moments in history like the Lincoln assassination, or even the crucifixion that have been written about so many times that I had to find a different way to tell it. I had to kind of prep for this. I read Ian Toll's book about the Midway and the early part of naval warfare in the Pacific, and there's no way I could compete with that. I mean, he was just so thorough, and a number of other authors that I'd read about Midway were just so thorough. But the focus was always obviously on the American participation. So I had to find a brand new way to tell the narrative, and so I decided to link it with, of all things, the Taking London book, which ended with the battleship Prince of Wales, with Churchill on board going across the Atlantic to meet with Roosevelt um, off the coast of Newfoundland. And so I opened this book with Prince of Wales, which has then been sent to the Pacific, to Singapore. And it's, the western part of the Pacific. Pearl Harbor is the eastern part of the Pacific. And this unsinkable battleship is sunk by the Japanese, by Japanese aircraft 2 days after Pearl Harbor. And it's a huge shock to the British public. It basically signals the end of the British Empire, the worldwide, the sun never sets empire. And so I had that. So I had this great moment, and I didn't want to write in depth about Pearl Harbor because that's also been done, and people know the story. And then I began looking for the context. Why do we care about Midway? It's named Midway because it's halfway between Tokyo and San Francisco, but why is it important? And you go back, it's this little, it's not big, it's this little atoll in the middle of the Pacific, discovered long ago by the Polynesians, but most recently by the Americans in 1859 because of a worldwide desire to find more bird poop, which was the most famous fertilizer in the world at the time. And farmers all across America needed more of this guano, and so that kind of the context of that, telling the story of Midway from 1859 up to 1940 and 1941, 1942. I'm trying to inform the reader of the significance of Midway and at the same time make it fascinating because the cast of characters that came through there begins a slow build to the Battle of Midway, and we see the importance of it. And I tried to not belabor that. It's a good 60 pages, but at the same time, the reader needs to know why we care about Midway. And once I establish that, then I can go into the battle. Then I can talk about the stakes. But surprisingly, that 60-page section that I put in there almost as an afterthought, just because I wanted to be able to tell the whole story from soup to nuts. For a lot of people, that's their favorite part of the book because from hearing from people, it's a form of entertainment they didn't expect from a battle narrative.
Hmm. You mentioned you read a bunch of books on Midway. What kind of primary sources did you rely on for this book too? Were there diaries, military dispatches, intelligence files, anything like that?
There is so much information about Midway. This could be a 10,000 page book. I mean, it literally could be because, all the intelligence has been released. So there is, there are books, there are official military reports. They're all published too. It's strange. If you go online, you can read these very detailed reports of the things that were going on, and like the the preparations for Midway, getting it ready for battle, and what the Marine Corps was doing. And it's just one of those things where as a sometimes as an author you can't get enough information and you're trying to find more detail because you always want to make the narrative so crisp that it's so vivid that the reader feels like they're actually there, they're transported to it. With Midway, it wasn't a lack of information, it was too much information. So there were parts of the battle that, like the Aleutian, feint by the Japanese, I really don't talk too much about it just because there's so much there that to keep the narrative really, really moving in a crisp and vivid way, there were a lot of details that I had to actually leave out.
How did you approach writing about Admiral Chester Nimitz in this book and his leadership during this critical time?
Well, my son went to the Naval Academy, and if people have a chance, they should go to the Naval Academy's museum. It's on the Yard, and it is one of the best history museums I've ever been to in my life. And they have a little display there about Nimitz, and they talk about how he lost a finger in a piece of machinery, and his academy ring saved his hand and saved his career. Um, so in the back of my mind, I knew that this guy was special. He was courageous, he was gutsy, but then when you read about him, then you realize the kind of pressure that he was under, and the fact that he was going to be fired if he didn't win the war quickly, or at least turn the tide in the war. And then you realize he's all alone. He'd always used his wife for support, and she's back in America. She's not, this is not the kind of war where the spouse is joined. And so he spent a lot of time by himself, and he developed insomnia. He developed, intestinal problems. And then one of the things as I was researching in Hawaii, I learned that what he used to do is a friend had a beach house on the North Shore, and he would actually leave Pearl Harbor, on weekends and just go to the North Shore, literally just go to the beach and just get his head back in order just by relaxing and hanging out on the beach, which is kind of a refreshing way to look at a naval admiral who you always think of as being spit and polished and always in, with the epaulets and, the crisp uniform.
Hmm. Martin, what lessons about modern warfare and intelligence can we draw from Midway?
Um, I think it's a couple things. It's to be open to innovation. I mean, there was a lot of people, at the very highest level, the CNO level, Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral King, who didn't trust this radio intelligence. They didn't trust this code breaking, and it's just one of those things. It was just new technology. So, as our world changes and we are introduced to new forms of technology, I think it's important that we are open to them. I mean, personally, for instance, as a writer, I fear AI. Everybody loves AI, but that could put me out of a job. Write they could write a whole book like that. So even I'm having to embrace it. But I think one of the things too that what we forget about is that those people, those American sailors and pilots willingly gave their lives or risked their lives for democracy and patriotism and freedom in what we perceive to be the American way of life. And I think of those, and so when they came home to America that was all those things. I think if some of those sailors could see some of the changes taking place in America right now with the return of fascism and totalitarianism at the highest levels of our government, I think they would be a little bit curious as to what they were actually fighting for and how we could become that kind of nation.
How did you become a writer?
That's a good question. When I was a kid, when I was 6, I told my mom, because I love books, and I said, Mom, I'm going to be a writer. And she said, don't be silly, writers don't make any money. And so uh, for years, I kind of put it out of my head. And meanwhile, I would skip class in college and go to the beach and read Hemingway and Hunter S. Thompson and pretty much everything else, and kind of wish I could become a writer, but knowing all the while they don't make any money. And I finally got a corporate job. I got married. I, graduated college, and just on a whim one day, because I hated my job so much, I reached out to a local magazine and asked if I could write a story for them. And what happened was I just began writing more and more of those stories, started getting paid for it. Soon enough, my income from writing magazine stories was equal to my income from the corporate job. And one of them had to give. And then I got a call. I was invited to go cover a 2-week adventure competition in Madagascar, of all places. So I'd take 3 weeks off from work, and I went and I had the time of my life. It was complete wilderness, you know, crocodiles, intense heat, snakes. But I loved it. And I got home, and my first day back at work, my boss fired me. And he took me to a restaurant. It was like very Jerry Maguire, took me to a restaurant, fired me. Um, but I was thrilled. I was glad to be fired. I didn't know how I could go back to the corporate world after such a great experience. And I went home and told my wife that I'd been fired. I was really happy. And I said, I think I'm going to try to make it as a writer. And she told me that she supported me. But she said there were just a couple rules. I had to be all in, no looking at want ads, no looking for other jobs. And I needed to find a way to make it work. And that was February 24th, 1994. And here we are.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite World War II film or book that gets the history just right?
Yeah, I can tell you too. Patton,
Mm.
the famous Patton movie
Oh,
is
yeah.
almost spot on. In the Battle of Britain, the Battle of Britain movie, and again, remember these movies were made within a quarter century of the end of the war. So a lot of the, for Battle of Britain, the Spitfires and Hurricanes and Messerschmitts were still the real thing. And in Patton, they filmed a lot of it in Spain, which wasn't the actual terrain, but they still had Shermans and Lees and Grants, all these different tanks. So it was very vivid, and the history was, I'm very critical of as an historian of movies that take liberties with history, and both those films were just right.
If you could have coffee or a beer with one historical figure from Taking Midway, who would it be and why?
Oh, that's a good point. I'd have to go with Spruance. The Admiral. He was not a carrier guy, and he gets pulled into it at the last minute. He's a friend of Nimitz's. He's known for being very methodical, very patient. As a matter of fact, as the carrier he's on, Yorktown, sails out to. No, he wasn't on Yorktown. What was he on? It's been a while since I wrote. Anyway, he spent the whole time in his cabin reading novels, Western novels, just to pass the time. And people were getting very impatient. They thought that he was gonna he didn't know what he was doing. And in fact, what he did was because he counseled patience. That was the reason that we won that battle, was because he was so fastidious about that. And I'd like to just know more of his methodology. Why did he do it? Where did that confidence come from?
And any plans to write about major turning points, other major turning points in World War II?
I will. Not yet though. I'm kind of I think about these taking books, and I wrote four in 4 years. It's super intense. It's all consuming. So I'm writing other books. I just finished one about the running boom of the 1970s, which is kind of up my alley. But I'm going to come back to the Taking series, but I'm for now I just want to breathe a little bit and not always be thinking about, armament and airplanes and dive bomber tactics.
Well, this one's out now. It's Taking Midway, Naval Warfare, Secret Codes, and the Battle That Turned the Tide of World War II. The author is Martin Dugard. Martin, thank you so much for joining me.
Steve, thanks very much for having me on. It's fantastic. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. And this is the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. Thanks for watching.